The Voyages of Magellan. Perhaps the greatest and most significant voyage in the 16th century was undertaken by the Portuguese navigator Magellan. Magellan, or more accurately his ship, was the first in man's history to make a complete circle around the globe. Before we take up the story of Magellan's voyage, let us consider some of the historical events which led up to it. Up to the year 1500, Venice and Genoa held a monopoly on the spice trade with the Orient. These Italian cities bartered for Eastern goods with Asia Minor, where the goods were brought from the Far East by a land route. The spice trade was the most valuable business in Europe at that time. Spices could literally be sold for their weight in gold. For this reason, Venice and Genoa became extremely wealthy and powerful. To break this monopoly, the Portuguese, under Prince Henry, explored the South Atlantic coast for a new trade route to the east. Travel by land was extremely slow in those days. Prince Henry knew that if he could find a water route to the east, he could transport goods from India and the Spice Islands much more rapidly than Venice and Genoa could do, because these cities depended upon a land route to the east. In this way, Portugal could become the most important commercial nation in the world. Prince Henry set up a school of navigation in Portugal. Ships were sent out to sail as far south along the African coast as they dared. They returned bringing information which was collected and studied at Prince Henry's school. Each expedition went further and further south. It seemed that the African continent had no southern limit. Finally, a breakthrough was made. In 1498, Diaz discovered the Cape of Good Hope, and Vasco da Gama reached India. The Cape of Good Hope was the extreme southern tip of Africa. Once a ship had rounded the Cape, it could begin sailing north to reach the fabulous Orient. It was precisely this that Vasco da Gama did. He returned from India with a load of valuable goods. Portugal had its water route to the east. Despite the huge distances involved, this route took less time than the one on which Venice and Genoa depended. We first hear of Ferdinand Magellan at the age of 25, a member of D'Almeida's expedition to conquer the East. Portugal decided that since it had such easy access to the Spice Islands, it should claim them for its own. In this way, Portugal could make even greater profits in the spice trade. The natives, however, were not willing to give their lands up to the Europeans without a fight. It was for the purpose of conquering them that D'Almeida and his army, which included Magellan, had been sent. In a series of battles in India, Malaya, and the Moluccas, the natives were conquered. Portugal was established as a colonial power in each of these areas. On the Malaya Peninsula, Magellan saw the riches of the spice trade. Pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, and many other valuable spices could be found in great abundance there. He saw that the future of Portugal lay in world trade, wondered if the best possible route to the east had been found. He began to wish that he too might go on exploratory voyages. But in 1512, he returned to Portugal, unknown except to his Malayan slave, Enrique. Fame had not yet come to Magellan. He continued to serve in the Portuguese army, never assuming positions of great authority. In 1513, Magellan was wounded fighting the Moors in Africa. He had been sent there with the Portuguese army in order to establish a foothold for his country in the Dark Continent. Portugal had been seized by the colonial fever and had decided that trading posts in Africa would be valuable. But Magellan had grown weary of the military life. He longed to make exploratory. In 1515, the King of Portugal refused Magellan money for an expedition around South America to the east. Magellan had argued to the king that the east could be reached more rapidly by sailing westward, south of South America, instead of sailing east, south of Africa. But the king was content with the route which he had already and refused to invest money in any more explorations. So in 1517, Magellan went to Spain to ask Charles V for the money. Magellan did not care whose flag he sailed under, as long as he was allowed to make the voyage he dreamed of. If the King of Portugal was not interested in his idea, perhaps the King of Spain would be. Magellan was right in his guess. King Charles and his counselors decided to back Magellan. They were jealous of the growing power and wealth of Portugal. They decided that it was a worthwhile risk to take. If Magellan found a shorter route to the east, Spain could take away Portugal's trade. Preparations for the voyage were begun immediately. 5 ships manned by 265 men were needed, besides immense stores, a total investment of $1.5 million. But King Charles knew that his investment would pay off handsomely if Magellan's route turned out to be shorter than Portugal's. Very soon the ships were ready to depart. And in September 1519, Magellan set sail from Sanlúcar, Spain. Magellan could hardly believe that he had finally begun the voyage which had filled his dreams for so many years. He knew the expedition would suffer many hardships, but he was sure that he would be successful. At the Canary Islands, Magellan received word that his Spanish captain planned mutiny. The Canary Islands were the only port between Spain and the New World. They were in regular communication with Europe. Somehow, the secret had leaked out in Spain that one of the captains, whose name was Mendoza, was planning to rebel against Magellan's authority. Mendoza had no faith in the voyage's chance for success. He was sure they would all be killed, and to prevent this, he planned on mutiny. Undaunted, Magellan started across the Atlantic. He knew he would never get a second chance to make his voyage. He would not turn back now. The mutiny would just have to take care of itself. Magellan believed that Mendoza would change his mind as the voyage progressed. But a great storm hit, scattering the ships. This was the first mishap which the voyagers experienced. They feared that all or some of the ships would be lost. Sailors, as everyone knows, are an extremely superstitious lot. They interpreted the storm as a bad omen for the journey. This did not prevent them from making every effort to keep the ships from foundering. But for a long time, it was doubtful whether the ships would survive the storm. However, on December 13th, 1519, they dropped anchor in the beautiful harbor of Rio de Janeiro. They had reached the New World. The first lap of the voyage was behind them. The sailors were somewhat comforted. Landing, they traded with the Indians to get food and water. On a voyage of this length, it would be necessary to make a number of stops for supplies. The ships could not carry a huge load of food. They had to rely on food which could be obtained in the ports where they docked. After they had replenished their supplies, they took up the voyage again. Sailing along the coast of modern Argentina, Magellan mistook the River Plata for a strait to the Pacific as the brutal winter began. He began sailing up the river until it became obvious that it did not lead to the ocean on the other side of the continent of South America. Magellan had to backtrack and continue his journey southward. The expedition worked south, exploring every inlet for the passage, but all of them led to dead ends. None extended all the way through to the Pacific. The Spanish soldiers began to be pessimistic about the voyage. A violent storm drove the expedition to spend the winter in a harbor that Magellan called San Julian. The sailors were cooped up here until the spring, because it was dangerous to continue the voyage in the face of the winter storms. Discontent and boredom were widespread among them. The possibility of mutiny became a greater and greater threat as each day passed. In April, the Spanish captains Mendoza, Quesada, and Del Cano plotted to seize the Santa Antonia, the largest of the ships. They wished to return to Europe and give up this voyage, which appeared to them to be sheer foolishness. It was time for the first move of revolt to be made. Quesada stabbed the master of the Santa Antonia, giving the plotters the 3 largest ships. They considered Magellan no real obstacle to their plan. Soon the leader of the expedition heard about the mutiny. At least I was warned that this might happen, he thought to himself. Magellan decided to strike quickly. For a moment, he had considered making a truce with the mutineers. allowing them to depart on the condition that 2 ships were left to him, so that he might continue the voyage. But he decided to make no compromises with the rebellious captains. He sent a boat with 6 men to negotiate with the rebel leader, Mendoza. The men were instructed to get back control of the ships at all costs. They took Mendoza by surprise and stabbed him. He died immediately. Magellan had already gained control of the Santa Antonia. The sailors on that ship made no attempt to resist Magellan's emissaries. Meanwhile, the crews of the other 2 ships refused to fight. The rebellious captains had no one to defend them. Thus the mutiny was put down almost before it had begun. Magellan knew he must re-establish order immediately. So the ringleaders, except Elcano, were put in irons. There they would stay until they could be turned over to the authorities at some Spanish port. Quesada, because he had shed blood, was executed. Let this be an example, Magellan said to his crews, of what will happen to any man who tries to stir up mutiny among our ships in the future. Magellan was sure the problem had been solved once and for all. In August 1520, the Santiago, sent ahead to explore, went on the rocks. Now there were only 4 ships left to continue the voyage. But Magellan sailed on down to the extreme tip of Argentina. He refused to allow any mishap to prevent him from reaching the Pacific. He felt certain that the Western Passage was close at hand. And on October 21st, 1520, Magellan discovered the strait that bears his name. The Straits of Magellan formed a passage among a number of islands at the southern tip of the continent of South America, leading to the Pacific. Magellan heaved a sigh of relief. Passing through the most perilous waters on Earth, Magellan discovered Mount Sarmiento. Somehow his ships managed to survive the storms and the treacherous currents of the straits. But the Santa Antonia deserted Magellan and sailed back to Spain with many supplies. There was little Magellan could do at this stage, so he allowed it to depart. However, Magellan sailed into the Pacific with only 3 ships. The second lap of the journey was behind them. Magellan was certain that they would reach the East Indies shortly. For 100 days they sailed without sighting land, and the supplies ran low. Magellan had underestimated the distance from South America to the continent of Asia. With the wine gone and the food spoiled, men ate rats and leather and drank brackish water. But it was too late to turn back now. They could only hope that they would reach land soon. In March 1521, Magellan sighted the Ladrone Islands, now called the Marianas. Magellan's crews were saved from starvation, but they still had not reached the Spice Islands. Magellan realized by now that his route to Asia was not a practical one, but he did not regret having made the voyage. On to the Philippines, where Magellan decided to help a native chief who was making war on a neighbor. He thought it might be useful to establish allies for Spain on the islands. So he joined his forces to the chief's army and fought beside his men. This proved disastrous, for the Spaniards were outnumbered. Even with the help of Magellan's crews, the chief's army was not able to resist its enemies. And Magellan was overpowered and killed on April 27th, 1521. He was never to complete his voyage around the world. Like many of his crewmen, Magellan was buried in the Philippines. Thereupon Elcano took control and sailed away. He had only one project now, to return to Europe as soon as possible, before he and his men fell prey to some new disaster. In the East Indies, 2 of the ships were found unfit, and the Victoria sailed alone. This was quite a reduction from the original number of ships, which had first set out from Spain so many months before. However, they stopped in the Indies to barter for spices to pay for the trip. If a full boatload of rare spices was brought back to Europe, Spain would not lose all of her investment in the expedition. On the way home, famine struck again, and the crew got scurvy. Scurvy is a disease which results from improper nourishment. The Victoria was far from any port where food might be obtained. As the famine spread, there was starvation among mountains of spices. The spices might be tasty, but they provided no nourishment. Luckily, the ship reached land before all of the crewmen starved. The Victoria sailed around the lower tip of Africa and began the last lap of the voyage. Finally, on September 6, 1522, they reached San Lucar, completing a voyage of 3 years. After so many hardships and dangers, the crewmen could hardly believe they had actually returned home. Of the 265 men who sailed, 18 returned, and of the 5 original ships, only 1 had completed the journey. Sadly enough, Magellan himself had only completed 3/4 of the voyage. Going to the Cathedral of Seville, the crew gave thanks for their safe return. People looked on them with amazement. They had done something which no other men had ever done. They had made a complete circuit of the globe. So ended Magellan's voyage, proving that the world was round, man's greatest achievement up to that time. This map is a diagram of the voyage made by Magellan ships. The vast distances involved perhaps make it accurate to describe Magellan as the greatest explorer in man's history.